All right. Well, yeah, I just want to thank you for inviting me today. I want to start by thanking you for all the time and energy you put into improving our local communities and the environment, such as your work on the urban tree canopy. I know how challenging this work can be, and I just want you to know that we see the work you're doing and we greatly appreciate you for it. So today, I want to talk about some of the challenges our urban and suburban birds face and where there are some opportunities for us to help secure a brighter future for them. Before we dive into that, just give you a little bit of background about Pilchuck Audubon and what we do. Washington State has 25 Audubon chapters, each with their own geographic area that they represent. And here at Pilchuck Audubon, we serve all of Snohomish County as well as Camano Island. We are your local chapter of the National Audubon Society. And between our local chapter members and the National Audubon member live within our area, we serve about 1,500 people. Our mission as a nonprofit is to conserve and restore natural ecosystems, focusing on birds and other wildlife for the benefit of the Earth's biological diversity. And we do this through a variety of ways, such as providing educational programs and classes, conducting community science and conservation efforts, as well as advocacy. So many of you may be aware that birds are declining across the spectrum. In 2019, a study really kind of shocked the conservation world when it found that we've lost 3 billion birds in North America since 1970, which is about 30% of all of our birds. Now, it's one thing to know that birds are declining, but it's another thing to quantify that decline. Can you imagine what it would be like to see 30% more birds in our neighborhoods, our parks, or our urban areas? And the very thrush is one example of one of our local birds that is declining. You may have seen them. They're really beautiful, related to the American robin. Sometimes they're easier to hear than to see, so you may have heard their beautiful song while hiking, which sounds like this. So definitely, it's a very unique song, and once you hear it, you'll probably never forget it. But their populations have declined 73% over the last 50 years, which averages to about 2.5% per year. And this is indicative of a broader trend in that 41% of all of our neotropical migratory songbirds are declining. Other Washington birds that are declining include the black-throated gray warbler, whose populations have declined 52% in the last 50 years. Lark sparrow has declined about 35%. And Wilson's warblers' populations have declined by 61%. So here's my question for you. What do you think are the major threats to birds or causes for their declines? Now, I'll open it up. Feel free to say your guesses.
Habitat loss.
How about just us?
Cats.
Urbanization in general.
Yeah, you guys are pretty much nailing all of them. Our biggest threats to birds are loss of habitat, climate change, domestic cats, and window collisions and light pollution. So those first two, most people guess, but a lot of people aren't aware that cats and window collisions are really big issues. Although one of you did say cats, so hats off to you. And so to address these threats, Audubon has an initiative called Bird Friendly Communities. And the goal of this initiative is to offset the impacts of development by restoring and protecting landscapes that allow native bird populations to survive in a growing community. And this initiative is focused on providing the 4 basic things that birds need to thrive: food, shelter, safe passage, and places to raise their young. So in this presentation, I want to focus on some of the more tangible things we can do here locally. So I'm not going to go real in-depth on climate change, but I do want to acknowledge that it is one of the major threats to our bird populations. In 2019, Audubon came out with a climate report called Survival by Degrees, 389 bird species on the brink, which found that 2/3 of our birds are at an increased risk of extinction due to climate change, and has projected that climate change will shift the ranges of many bird species if global temperatures continue to rise. And this will force them to either adapt quickly if they are to survive, or potentially go extinct. So going back to our earlier example of the varied thrush, this map on your screen is its current distribution. So the area in that kind of orangish tan color is where you currently can find varied thrushes. But this report modeled what that range would look like with different scenarios of climate change. And so if we have 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures, the map you see on your screen now will show you what that range will look like if that temperature change occurs. So the areas in red are where the varied thrush will lose suitable habitat. And the areas in that light blue are where it will potentially gain habitat. But you probably can't read it because it's small font, but what you'll notice is that it says 34% range lost and 26% range gained. So overall, that's a net loss of suitable habitat. If we look at the next warming scenario, 2 degrees Celsius, it has 44% range loss and 24% gained. So even less suitable habitat. And then the 3 degrees Celsius scenario, 58% range lost and only 20% range gained. So that's a net loss of almost 50% of its suitable habitat. And so as you can see from these maps, climate change will have a very negative effect on many of our species, and we may even lose some of our local species, such as the varied thrush, which in this model has no suitable habitat remaining in Washington. So going back to our list of threats, first on that list was habitat loss. Historically, much of Western Washington looked like this. But over the past century, we've taken what was once a contiguous landscape of native plants and transformed much of it into a sterile monoculture of turfgrass lawns and decorative non-native plant species. 54% of the US has been developed into this suburban-urban matrix, which is composed of the patchwork of cities and towns with small remnants of fragmented habitat between and within them. Even where there is available green space, such as our yards, they typically look like the yards in this photo, which provide no suitable habitat for most wildlife. When we do add more plants to our yards, they're typically non-native ornamentals. And now these non-native ornamentals look nice, but they don't really provide any value for our wildlife. Our native birds evolved with our native plants, meaning that native plants provide both our resident and our migratory birds the resources they need when they need them. Native plants provide shelter and nesting sites, as well as food in the form of berries and fruits, nuts and seeds, nectar. And then the fourth food group is something we don't usually think of as being provided by plants, and that is insects. In fact, a whopping 96% of land birds feed insects to their chicks. If adult birds can't find those insects, then they have no protein-rich food to feed their young. So we know that most of our native birds must find insects to feed their chicks. What does that have to do with native plants? Well, here on the left, we have a native oak tree, and on the right, we have a non-native ginkgo tree. Our native oaks in the US are in the genus Quercus, and they can host over 550 species of caterpillars.
Wow.
Whereas the ginkgo, a commonly planted ornamental landscaping tree from Asia, supports only 5 species of caterpillars here in the US. So when you're a bird in search of food for your young, that difference is really critical. And non-native plants dominate the landscaping industry, and for the most part are unpalatable to our native insects. And that's a large reason that we've planted them, is because they're advertised as pest-free. Unfortunately, pest-free means a sterile environment with no food for our young birds. So the importance of native plants to all animals, including humans, is largely about insects, and in particular, the caterpillars. Native plants and insects co-evolved over millions of years, and our native insects are not adapted to feed on the non-native plant species that dominate our traditional urban and suburban landscapes. So without native plants, native insects have nothing to eat. And without the insects, the birds have nothing to eat. And again, why is this important? Well, baby birds eat a lot of caterpillars. A chickadee pair brings between 390 to 570 caterpillars to the nest per day. Another way to think about it is that chickadees feed their young for 16 days. So 570 caterpillars times 16 days is over 9,000 caterpillars for one chickadee nest. And so looking at this difference again, that's a 100-fold difference in the number of species supported. And that has profound implications for a nest of baby birds. So what are some things we can do? Well, we can contribute by turning our urban and suburban landscapes that are neat, simple, lifeless, with lots of lawn and a few non-native plants, into something much more nourishing for birds and wildlife. By converting these spaces into native plant gardens or landscapes, we're solving a number of issues for wildlife and the environment. Not only are native plants necessary for birds and insects, but they're better for climate because they require fewer resources to maintain. For instance, native plants generally require less water as they're adapted to our local climate. And they also provide a number of ecological benefits that traditional lawns do not. Restoring native plants makes our spaces look more like nature and therefore act more like nature. Native plants will help improve soil retention, so you'll have less erosion and improved soil stability. Urban lawns have actually been shown to be net greenhouse gas emitters. So by converting your lawn to native plants, you'll actually be making a significant change in carbon emissions and sequestration in your space. And with more natural vegetation community, you'll have less water runoff, which will improve stormwater management and reduce resources required for it. Native plants also require less pesticides and other chemicals than a traditional lawn. Half of US lawns are maintained with chemicals, and those chemicals are actively killing the insects that birds need to survive. Not to mention, the pesticides directly kill millions of birds every year as well. By transforming your lawn into native plants, you'll also be reducing your greenhouse gas emissions because you won't be mowing as much. Lawnmowers account for up to 5% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So even if you can shave off 5 minutes of mowing time, over the course of the year, that can really add up to a lot of reduced emissions, and that's just 1 yard. And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. You don't have to get rid of your entire lawn and convert it to native plants. Even just a border or a portion of it makes a difference because every little bit matters. And then I just have a few photos of some examples of people who've done this. And I like this first one because you'll notice that it's not a yard. A lot of people in Western Washington live in condos or apartments, don't have a traditional lawn, but they have patio space or balconies. So this is one example of you could do native plants in pots. And so this is one example from Baltimore. Here's a gentleman from Missoula, Montana, who's been gardening with native plants for over 20 years. And an Audubon staff person from Arkansas converted 70% of their yard to native plants. And you may not think that 1 yard can make a difference, but when added together, that can be a really big impact. So this is a map of Portland. Portland Audubon has their own backyard habitat certification program that they run, and they have over 3,000 properties registered as habitat within the city of Portland. And so you may not think that your yard would make a big difference, but when you have 3,000 of your neighbors doing it as well, that can really make a huge impact. And by transforming our lawns to living landscapes, every yard can be a sanctuary for birds. And this applies not only to residential properties, but we can apply all of this to commercial properties, schoolyards, libraries, city properties, and so on. And so the next threat that was on our list is cats. According to the most current research, free roaming outdoor cats kill an estimated 1.3 to 3.9 billion birds each year. I'm just going to pause for a second and let that sink in, because those numbers are astronomical, but they're also highly preventable, and there's some really easy fixes for this one. Keeping your cat indoors is the best thing that you can do. Many people think that their cats don't kill wildlife outside because they've never seen it bring anything to the house. A lot of times they won't. And so just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean they don't do it. And so the number one thing you can do is keep cats indoors. The other one, and kind of my personal favorite, is you can install a catio. Just provides an outdoor space for your cat to get some fresh air, but keeps them separated from the wildlife. And it's important to remember too that keeping your cat separate from wildlife is also better for your cat. It'll stay healthier because it won't be picking up diseases from wildlife and potentially bringing those diseases back into your home. Another component of bird-friendly communities is bird-safe buildings. This building is most certainly not bird-safe. As you can imagine, a bird flying by this building isn't going to be able to discern whether the trees in the reflection are real or not. And unfortunately, the consequences of that are very real. On October 2nd, 2020, more than 1,000 migrating songbirds collided with buildings within a small area in downtown Philadelphia, killing hundreds of small birds such as warblers. The birds in this photo are just a fraction of what was collected on the ground by a volunteer that morning. And just to be clear, this isn't a fluke. It's not a one-time occurrence. May 2017, in Galveston, Texas, nearly 400 dead birds from colliding into a building. Earlier this month, Chicago, Illinois, nearly 1,000 dead birds from colliding with one building. Overall, building collisions kill an estimated 1 billion birds per year. Again, that's billion with a B. But again, there are some easy solutions to this problem. And we can help prevent window collisions by adding netting in front of windows or applying tape or decals to make the window visible to birds. And there's actually a lot of new technology coming out right now for this, such as new types of glass that have different coatings on them that only birds can see, such as UV coating, because birds can see UV light and humans can't. And on top of that, some of these new windows are more energy efficient and help combat climate change too. Here's just another example of a window with some decorative bird decals on it. Another contributing factor to building collisions is light pollution. 80% of birds actually migrate at night, and like a moth to flame, they can be attracted to artificial light. When this happens, it can cause them to fly into windows, and it can also disorient them, causing them to fly in circles and basically exhaust themselves. There was one building in Chicago that over the course of 20 years had 30,000 birds hit it that we know of. To try and fix this issue, they started turning off unnecessary lighting. Because of that, they actually reduced bird mortalities by 80% just by turning off unneeded lighting. Additional benefits from this is it saves money and reduces energy consumption. And here's just the one example. This is the tribute light in New York City for the Twin Towers. And that you might be able to see in this photo, there's some little specks of things flying around. Most of those are birds, probably some bats in there. But New York City Audubon actually monitors this because birds get caught in this light and they get disoriented and just circle around. And so they work with the city to turn the lights off every once in a while to keep the birds from getting disoriented and exhausted. But this is one example of light pollution in one of our major cities. And some things that you can do to help reduce light pollution is turn off exterior decorative lighting, can downshield exterior lighting whenever possible. So many lights just disperse light in all directions, but you can focus it so it only points to the ground. Extinguish any pot and floodlights, reduce atrium lighting, install motion sensors and timers, turn off exterior lighting, especially in the higher stories of buildings, and use task lighting or put window coverings down or pull blinds down or close curtains. And so, as you can tell, we have a lot of unnecessary bird mortality in our urban and suburban areas, which means that there's lots of opportunities to make a difference. Here I've listed just a few ideas on where I think progress can be made. And most of these will require partnerships and collaborations with different groups. And if any of these interest your organization, I'd love to talk with you more about them. There are Audubon groups across the country doing all of these things already. So I know that they can be done if there's support and momentum around them. So bird safe buildings is just getting some basic data. How many birds are dying from colliding with our buildings? And there's tools out there to do this. There's volunteer groups that are already starting to do this in Seattle. If we want to work more on the policy side, we can try and update building codes and laws to include bird and climate friendly design. New York City Audubon's doing this a lot. Lights out. A lot of this is promoting individual awareness. A lot of people don't know that these things are issues. So that's the first step, is just educating the general public about them. And then working with organizations and policymakers and other groups who are interested in developing more comprehensive solutions that can be effective on a broader scale. And the same with native plants. And so with that, I'd love to take any questions you have. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that our chapter is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we're really proud of that. And looking forward to the next 50 years and working with organizations like yours on making our cities and suburban areas more bird and wildlife friendly. So with that, thank you. And I'll take any questions if you have them.
Brian, well, I'm not seeing the hands go up yet, but Brian, what about solar panels? Is there any study about what that's doing with bird migration and birds colliding? I know, yeah, I've heard that it's not always the best, especially when they're generating electricity down in California and places when they're huge solar farms.
Yeah, so Audubon, Washington. So if you're not familiar with the Audubon structure, we have local chapters, but then we also have a state office here in Washington called Audubon, Washington. They work on more of these wider scale issues, a little bit more than we do. And Trina Bayard is their director of conservation or director of science. And she's been on a few different working groups at the state level, working with groups on prioritizing I'm gonna forget the specific term now. Basically, least conflict solar siting is what it is. So, looking at the landscape and figuring out which areas will have the least conflict with wildlife, with agriculture, with all sorts of different factors, and basically mapping out which areas will have the least conflict with those user groups. And so they've done that in Eastern Washington. They've identified some areas that if we're gonna install these solar farms, wind farms, things like that, like these are the areas we should try and focus on to reduce any harm to wildlife. And so there are organizations, Audubon's doing it. We're not doing it at our chapter level, but at the state level, we are looking at that. So yeah, it's Audubon's preference is to install solar panels where we already have infrastructure. So rooftop solar, things like that. So we're not losing habitat by adding solar panels in those locations. But where we are putting it in habitat, trying to find areas that are least conflict.
Jim has his hand up there. Jim, you want to ask your question here to Brian?
I guess that I have a number of comments, and it just cut me off if I ramble on too long. I'll try to keep it to a couple of minutes. We have a backyard conservancy. It's been verified by the state fish and wildlife folks. So it's 3 acres, sits out in back of our yard. Of our home. And I wouldn't say it has a lot of native species and everything. And I have to tell you, we don't have many birds, but we have a lot of cats in our area. I suspicion that might be an issue. I noticed that the varied thrust trill sounds like it's rolling, like a language, German language, where you roll your R's. I just made a comment there. I never heard of catios, but that's very interesting. And I notice these are all similarities to what's happening with the monarch butterfly as far as its flight path down the West Coast and all, and how come they're disappearing and have a hard time and everything. Same sort of same sort of thing. I don't know, cats maybe even like butterflies. I would think they would. Let's see. Oh, and I wanted to mention to Joan, maybe in this meeting is probably the best thing to do. I'm a believer in Gaia, an unusual, not scientifically proven theory, but that the Earth is itself God, all of a sudden now I can't think of the term. Ecosystem. Thank you. And as you go down the scale, you could consider Snohomish County as an ecosystem. We look at trees, we look at, individual things that we can do that relate to the climate and climate change and global warming and everything, but we don't look at it holistically. And I think that's a mistake, because you change one part of an ecosystem and it impacts on other parts of the ecosystem. You can't just, in our instance, work on trees, which is a good thing, without considering the rest, how that's going to impact on the rest of the ecosystem, or what rest of your ecosystem do you need in order to bring back our wildlife. So I would think, Joan, we could, expand beyond trees and just take the whole darn ecosystem into account. And maybe even tell national, CCL, National League of Women Voters to make that a priority item. I mean, think of the impact there. So that's my comments.
Thank you, Jim. Brian, first of all, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. But I was especially interested in what you said at the beginning about the varied thrush. And this is a very personal comment. I saw my first one in my backyard just a number of weeks ago. And we've had my garden club's had Candy Brown as our guest speaker a number of times. And shot off an email to Candy. I said, Candy, what is this bird? You know, what is this bird? It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful, that's visiting in my backyard. I mean, I've lived here 41 years, and this is the first sighting. And so I looked up its habitat and its habitat range, and I'm thinking forest and forestry, and I'm thinking, why in the world is this the first time that I've actually seen one? You know, it was an amazing experience. They are beautiful, and I have what I call my bird tree with the bird feeders and all of that good stuff over there. It's a crabapple tree, and the birds just seem to love it in all of its stages. You know, it's going into its winter stage now, but it seems to be a source. But this one it was low on the ground and a delight. I'm glad. I was sad when I heard the statistic about how they've lost almost 75% of the population. Just absolutely made me cry inside, because it's so absolutely beautiful. And so I will keep my eyes open. I hope for more, and maybe we can, as we work for more trees in our area, maybe we can restore more habitat for them to return. I also wondered on the building code. I know it sounds like you're not working on the bigger thing on solars, but does your organization try to work with the planning commission on arranging building code? You know, that building codes and changing building codes, I'm not sure what that means. Can you tell me what it means in terms of the Audubon Society?
Yeah, so it's not something we currently have capacity for, but it's something that other Audubon chapters have. I've seen them starting to work in this area a little bit. New York City Audubon, in particular. I was looking at their website the other day, and they've actually passed some legislation in New York that they've updated what's required on new builds, like what type of windows and things like that. So that's where some of this could come in. I think it would be a lot of work, but anything that's worthwhile is always a lot of work. And trying to look at where we can make comprehensive changes and versus just individual lifestyle changes, things like that. Working with the cities, the municipalities, and things like that is where long term where we're going to make the biggest difference. And so starting to look at some of these opportunities to get some of these bird friendly, climate friendly things into policies or codes or whatnot could really be a game changer long term. But it's something we're just starting to dip our toe into. We haven't, let's say I'm the only staff the chapter has, and we're mostly volunteer based. And so it hasn't been a priority thus far, but I think it could be going forward in the future.
I should let Kate speak to this, but you know that we're going in front of the Planning Commission on the 24th to really support the urban tree canopy policy and the protection of our forests countywide. We really have been battling this retention, preservation, protection, planting of trees for many decades. And we are up against a very well-financed opponent in the Master Builders Association and their components. It has never been an easy task to testify on behalf of the critters that surround us and our need to share our planet and do it in such a way that we can absolutely preserve the diversity that makes us thrill when we see something like a varied thrush in our backyard. So I hope you realize that we need all the support we can be that can be there, Brian. We want to show a big show of force. So Jim, I see your hand is up again, and I know that you always have something wise to say. So quickly here.
I don't know if wise is the term. I just want to make a comment that woodpeckers really like wooden roofs. In case you've never had any of them peck on your roof at a particular time, I always thought that was kind of fun. And keepers, I had an associated thought there, but I lost it. So sorry about that. Oh, no. I'll think of it later and tell you, Joan. Okay.
Well, they don't always just like roofs. They like things that can make a lot of noise to attract a mate. And so I've had one that comes every year and pecks around my chimney.
That's true.
To try to attract. But it just makes a lot of noise for that season. I'm just used to it at this point in time.
I remember what the other comment was. For those of you who may not be aware, although I think most of you are, that snags make really good things for birds. Don't knock down those old trees that don't have any more life, you think, in them, because not having life is a good thing for some species, including birds and insects and what have you. Even if they fall down, it's even better. I have some of that in my conservancy, if you will. So I take good care of my snags.
I will never look at an oak tree in the same way again, Brian. I'll tell you, knowing all those little caterpillars are there to help feed the chickadee.
So many.
Margie.
I found this very compelling and very educational. I was amazed at how much of this I did not know. I want everyone to know it now. I'm so glad we're recording this. Anybody have a problem with putting a recording in the Sierra Club newsletter?
The link to it, that's not a problem at all, Margie, and we love for people to share. That's why we're here, as an educational base for the public and for all those that are concerned about our environment and building a healthy community. I am thrilled to see you guys here, and I know that you will share what an exciting program this was. Brian, thank you. You don't have to stay for the rest of our program. We have just a regular reports and things of that nature that we will be carrying on, but you are welcome to stay. And as we go through, I gave you the agenda earlier, so you can look at it and decide, whether or not you want to be here for that. But